Well, tonight we're going to look at Ruth chapter 3, verses 6 through 10. Since it was a business meeting last week, a quick review. Act 1 is death and emptiness. Naomi and her husband go to Moab with their two boys because of a famine. While they're in Moab, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, passes away. The two boys marry Moabite women, and about 10 years later, both of the sons pass away. So Naomi, at the end of Act 1, comes back to her hometown of Bethlehem in the land of Israel, in the tribe of Judah, and she comes back with Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law. The other daughter-in-law decided to stay in Moab, but Ruth insists that she come back to the land of Israel with Naomi. And Act 1 ends with the only good news in the entire chapter, that it's barley harvest season. And that leads us to Act 2, which is the search for short-term security. Naomi and Ruth are both widows. And in the ancient world, especially, you needed a man to take care of you and support you and provide for you. But these two women are now living alone, and Ruth comes up with the idea, we have no food, so maybe I should go out and glean in the fields and find some grain so that we can eat. And so the whole idea is we need to survive. And Ruth goes out, not knowing where she's going. She's never been in the land of Israel before, but she happens into a field that's owned by a man named Boaz. And Boaz happens to be related to Naomi through her husband Elimelech, although we're never told the exact relationship, but they are related. And Boaz hears about Ruth in her story, especially her kindness and love for her mother-in-law. So when Boaz meets up with Ruth, he's very kind to her. He wants to repay the kindness that she has shown to Naomi. So Ruth goes home that day with enough food to feed her and Naomi for about 2 months. I mean, it was a huge day of gleaning. You know, normally if you were out gleaning, if you came up with enough food for that day and maybe another day, you were doing well. But she's got enough food for a couple of months. She's been very blessed. So she gets home, and Naomi is absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of food that Ruth comes home with. So much so that Naomi has been absolutely depressed. But seeing the food kind of snaps her out of her depression. So as we get to the end of Act 2, we have this notice at the very end that Ruth is living with her mother-in-law. And short-term security, yes, but it's not long-term permanent security, and that's the subject of Act 3. Because Ruth is living with Naomi, Naomi comes up with this idea that Ruth needs a husband. And back in the ancient world, most marriages were arranged. So Naomi is the mother-in-law, so she decides, Ruth needs a husband, and I'm the only relative she has, so I'm going to come up with a plan to help this girl find a husband. And so she does, and that's the subject of Act 3. There are 3 scenes in Act 3. In verses 1 through 5 is the conversation between Naomi and Ruth, and that's when Naomi's plan is presented. And we'll look at part of that as a review in just a second. Then the key part is verses 6 through 15, when Ruth has to pull off Naomi's plan. It's one thing to come up with a plan, it's another thing to execute the plan. It's kind of like football. It's one thing to have this great game plan, but the team has to execute the plan. Well, Naomi's got the plan, but Ruth has to put the plan into action. And that's in verses 6 through 15, and we'll look at part of that tonight. And then finally, Ruth will come home and tell Naomi everything that happened. And that's how this particular scene will close. Well, scene 1 is that Ruth is going to accept Naomi's plan. And Naomi has this incredible plan to find Ruth a husband. She is to go down to where the men are at the threshing floor. Now, this is the last part of the harvest season. And because it's the last part, they winnow, meaning that they get the chaff to blow away, and what's left is the grain. So this is the pure grain. This is what they're going to sell in the marketplace. So the men do this at the threshing floor, and they actually sleep there overnight because they need to protect the grain from potential thieves and wild animals who would just love to come in and eat the grain. So the men are there to not only harvest, but also to protect the grain. So Boaz is going to be at the threshing floor. And Naomi knows exactly where Boaz is going to be. And Naomi thinks that Ruth and Boaz would make a wonderful couple. So she's got a plan to make this happen. And the plan begins in verse 3 where Naomi says to Ruth, wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. So she's going to look as good as she can possibly look and smell as lovely as she could possibly smell. And so she's got her best clothes on, and then she's going to go down to the threshing floor. Now, here's the interesting part of this. At night in Bethlehem, where they live, they lock the gates at night. And then they'll unlock the gates in the morning. That way, predators can't get in, people can't come in and steal things, animals can't get in either. And so it's a safe place for a woman to be during the night, is in the protection of the city. But Ruth's got to sneak out before they lock the gates. And she's going down to the threshing floor where the men are. Now, the only women who could possibly be at the threshing floor are prostitutes. The men who are there do not bring their wives. They do not bring their families. It's just men. But prostitutes think this is a great idea to go down and offer their services to men while the city's locked. So Ruth is going to go down there, and she's going to the threshing floor. But Naomi says, don't let him know you're there. So she's got to sneak down to the threshing floor. She's got to spot Boaz, which she knows who Boaz is. But she's got to do this in such a way that nobody sees her. Because if one of the other men see her, they're going to conclude she's a prostitute. So she's got to be sneaky. And she has to find Boaz. And she can't get back into the city until the next morning, when the sun comes up and they unlock the gates. So this is a risky plan that Naomi comes up with. And so then wait till Boaz is finished eating and drinking, and then when he lies down, when it's time for him to sleep, which that means that Ruth has to keep an eye on him and watch which tent he goes into. Because God forbid she goes into the wrong tent. I mean, that story would have a different conclusion. So she has to make sure she goes into the right tent, and she's to uncover his feet and lie down. And apparently she uncovers his feet and part of his legs so that when it gets colder that night and the wind begins to get cold, that he'll wake up. So that's the plan. And we also find out that she lies down at his feet, kind of like a servant would do. Then, when Boaz wakes up, he will tell you what to do. So, that's the plan. And in verse 5, Ruth responds, I will do whatever you say. That would not have been my response. I would have said, you've got to be kidding. I mean, this is the best plan you can come up with? I mean, this is risky. This is crazy. I mean, I'm not sure I've got the guts to pull this off. But apparently Ruth is willing to make this happen. And she says, I will do whatever you say. And we know from Ruth's character, if Ruth says she's going to do something, she does it. So that brings us to tonight in scene 2. And it's the private encounter between Ruth and Boaz. And this scene is marked off and framed by 2 topographical references. In verse 6, Ruth goes down to the threshing floor. Then in verse 15, it says he went back to town. And some of the manuscripts say she went back to town. And in reality, they both go back into town. So she's going down to the threshing floor. A scene's going to take place. And the scene will end when she goes back to town. Now, the scene is in two unequal parts. In verses 6 through 13, that's part 1. And that will happen during the evening. And it kind of concludes a little bit after Boaz wakes up around midnight. Then scene 2, which is shorter, is when they both go back to sleep, wake up a few hours later, and have to sneak out of the tent and go back to town without anyone noticing that they were together. So that's how the scene breaks down. So let's look at how it begins. So she, Ruth, went down to the threshing floor. Yes, she did. So after this incredible plan is laid out by Naomi, and Ruth says yes, the author is going to let us know that Ruth is going to carry out this plan. So the scene is going to move from Naomi's house to the threshing floor. That's going to be the main scene of this particular act. Now it says she went down to the threshing floor. Bethlehem was built on a hill, which was normal back in those days. You always built your towns on a hill, then you put a wall around it. So if you get attacked, they have to come up the hill to get you, and they have to somehow get through the wall. And as they're trying to do that, you can shoot you can shoot arrows at them, you can throw stones at them, and possibly keep them from attacking you. So literally, she goes down to the threshing floor because she's going to walk down in order to be able to do that. Now, we know that Ruth is going to do whatever Naomi asked her to do. But the question is, how is she going to pull this off? Because something could go wrong. Then what will be the outcome when it's all said and done? For example, is she going to be able to sneak down to the threshing floor, find Boaz, but nobody sees her? Is she going to be able to hide so that nobody notices that there's a woman lurking around spying on us? Also, will she actually go into Boaz's tent while the man is sleeping? Will she really uncover his feet and legs and lie down there? And then, what in the world is Boaz going to do when he wakes up? I mean, obviously he's there to protect the grain. And we're going to find out he lays down in a tent pretty close to where the pile of grain is because, that's his money. Because he's going to eventually take that grain into town and he's going to sell it. If there's somebody in his tent, might he mistake her for a thief and a robber? And I'm sure that Boaz is sleeping somewhere near a sword so that he can protect himself and his investment in the grain. So this is a very risky thing to do. But Ruth decides, I'm going to do it. And we talked a little bit last week about what happens if God asks us to do something that makes us uncomfortable. Step out of your comfort zone and do this. Do you have the bravery, the guts to pull that off? Are you willing to take a chance and do something new? Try out a new ministry. Do something you've never done before. It's an adventure. And apparently Ruth is up for the adventure. Verse 7, we find out that Ruth makes the preparations. She's taken a bath. She's all perfumed up. She's in her best clothes. She sneaks down to the threshing floor. And Naomi's got it right. Boaz is going to work really hard that day because they're harvesting. They're winnowing, getting rid of the chaff, collecting the grain. And then at the end, Boaz and all of his men will enjoy a festive meal, celebrating all of the harvest that God has provided. And then he's going to be so tired, he's going to go off to his tent. He's going to lie down and fall asleep because he's probably got to do the same thing all over again the next day. And that's exactly what happens. Boaz had finished eating and drinking with his men, and he was in good spirits. He was happy. Now, some say he was in good spirits based upon how much wine he had drunk, and that might be a possibility, but knowing Boaz and his integrity, probably not. I mean, this is a businessman, and he doesn't want to do something stupid and mess up his investment in the grain. So chances are he's just very thankful, feels very blessed that God had given him this wonderful harvest, and he's in an absolutely wonderful, good mood at this point. So he's cheerful, he's relaxed, everything is going great. He went to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. So apparently, he's at pretty close to where the grain pile is. And from Ruth's perspective, it's at the far end of the grain pile. And this is very specific because Ruth is doing what she's supposed to be doing. Keeping a close eye on Boaz. Making sure that she knows which tent he goes into. And she does this very well. And this is possibly a wonderful thing, that Boaz's tent is located at the far end of the grain pile. Maybe he's kind of out there by himself because he is the landowner, he is the boss. Maybe it's his private tent or shelter that he has there. And maybe he's a little distance from the other men, which would be easier for Ruth because she has to sneak into his tent without anybody seeing her. So if Boaz's tent was right in the middle of everybody else's tent, well, that could be difficult. But if it's kind of isolated, this might work out really well. And when the poor guy wakes up in the middle of the night and they have a conversation, well, maybe nobody's going to be able to hear the conversation if he's a distance from everyone else. So far, so good. This is working out wonderfully for Ruth. Just like Naomi said it was going to work out. So she approaches quietly. She uncovers his feet and lies down. She does it. Boaz is there in his tent. And according to one of the ancient commentators, Ruth waits until Boaz is snoring before she enters the tent. So the guy's obviously asleep. She's very quiet. She enters into his sleeping quarters. She uncovers his feet and legs, and then she lies down at his feet. So she does everything she's supposed to do. It's working out. No problem so far. In the middle of the night, and we could translate that at midnight. The Hebrew can mean either the middle of the night or midnight, and most scholars think it's about midnight. Now, literally in the Hebrew, it says, the man trembled and turned over. He trembled, he turned over. The NIV translates it, something startled the man, which means he trembled, and then he turned. Well, if this plan works according to Naomi's little scheme, chances are, with his feet uncovered in the cool night air, he may have shivered. And so he's sleeping, outside in his tent. He gets cold. He wakes up and he shivers and he turns over and tries to grab his covers to cover himself up because he's now cold. He also is startled. And we're really not sure what startled him. It could be that when he woke up, Ruth woke up too. Or maybe Ruth woke up first, and that woke him up. We're really not sure what happened, but we do know that something startled him. And all of a sudden, he's aware of the fact he's not alone. There's somebody in the tent, which I'm sure at this point he's wide awake. Because you never know what he's thinking. I mean, who is this person? Is it somebody trying to kill him? Is it somebody trying to steal his grain? What's going on here? And in the Hebrew, it's a little more dramatic than the NIV. Because the Hebrew literally translates, and look, a woman lying at the place of his feet. So, the poor guy wakes up and he looks around and goes, there's a woman in my tent. And she's lying at my feet. It's like, how did that happen? What's going on here? Surprise, surprise. Boaz is the most surprised man in the city of Bethlehem that night. The poor guy wakes up after a long day of work and some wonderful food and some wine. He wakes up in the middle of the night and there's a woman at his feet. Well, somehow he knows it's a woman. It could be from the moonlight he can tell it's a woman. It could be that Ruth wore so much perfume, he's absolutely convinced it has to be a woman. We're really not sure. But we do know this, he can't identify her. It's also worth pointing out that Ruth is at his feet. She takes the position of a servant. If she would have been a prostitute, she would have been at his side. But instead, she's at his feet. So this poor guy wakes up, and there's a woman in his tent. And he's the boss, and he's the landowner, and he may have even said to the other guys, there may be prostitutes around, but don't you dare get caught with one in your tent. And here he is, he's got a woman in his tent. And so in verse 9, which verses 9 and 10 are the two most important verses in this story, Boaz asks the most obvious question. Who are you? I think I would have asked, who are you and what do you want? Because that would have been important too. But he asked the question, who are you? And this gives Ruth a perfect opportunity to identify herself, to also identify herself in such a way that she can explain how she sees herself. Because earlier, Ruth introduced herself as a foreigner, as a Moabite. This also gives Ruth a perfect opportunity to explain, what in the world are you doing in a man's tent at midnight? What's up with this? So it's a perfect opportunity for Ruth to explain. And she does. I am your servant, Ruth. Now she begins by saying that she is a servant. It's interesting that she doesn't call herself a Moabite. She doesn't call herself a foreigner. She doesn't even call herself a widow. She simply identifies herself as a servant. Because if she was a foreigner, then maybe he's not interested in her. If she's a widow and she's still grieving, then he can't be interested in her. But she's a servant. Now, Ruth had been hanging out with Boaz's female servants all through the gleaning season. He would follow the female servants and pick up the grain. So she considers herself a servant. He's the master. She is the servant. And the two of them cannot be any more different. Think about it. Ruth is a servant. Boaz is the master. He's a landowner. She's an uninvited guest at the moment, and she's in his tent. He owns the tent. She's a female, and he's a male. She's a foreigner. She's a Moabite. He's a native. He's an Israelite. She's poor. He's very rich. Completely different. What a contrast. I am your servant. And that title kind of fits where she is socially. She also says, I am Ruth. She identifies herself with her personal name. And early on, sometimes that wasn't true, that she would not do that. She didn't have the confidence to say, I'm Ruth. But by this point, she's kind of integrated into Israelite society. She's ready to move on with her life. And so she identifies herself in a personal way. I am Ruth. So this is an intimate, personal encounter. And Ruth wants this to end with perhaps a marriage proposal or a marriage acceptance. So she identifies herself personally as Ruth. And it's interesting also that apparently they know each other well enough that when she says, I am Ruth, he knows which Ruth she is. He recognizes her voice, and she would recognize his. Now, Naomi said, when he wakes up, he's going to tell you what to do. But that's not what happens next. Instead of Boaz telling Ruth what to do, Ruth is going to tell Boaz what to do. Because the next thing she says is, spread the corner of your garment over me. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. But the instruction comes from Ruth. Boaz doesn't tell her what to do next. Now, that raises a question. As the author is writing this, did he leave this out because he didn't want to give away the punchline? Which, by the way, you'll find out in a moment. Spread the corner of your garment over me is the punchline. So maybe Naomi told her to say that, but the author didn't record it because he didn't want to give away the story too soon. That's one possibility. The other possibility is Ruth is enjoying this opportunity. And she's saying, this is my opportunity to take advantage of this situation, to do what I need to do, and I'm up for the challenge. And so she's the one who initiates this. So did Naomi tell her to do that, or is she doing this on her own? Is she taking things into her own hands and making things work out the way she wants? It's also interesting, it doesn't show up in the English. In the Hebrew, it says, spread the wing of your garment over your handmaid. That's what it literally says. And it brings up this word wing, which is interesting because it was used back in chapter 2, verse 12. This is when Ruth and Boaz first meet. And Ruth looks at Boaz and basically says, I'm a foreigner. I'm a Moabite. I'm the new person in town. Why are you being so nice to me? And that's when Boaz says, I've heard what you did for Naomi. And then in verse 12, Boaz pronounces a blessing upon Ruth. And here's what he says. May the Lord repay you, Ruth, for what you have done. And he was thinking of good things, the kindness that she had shown to Naomi. So may the Lord repay you for all the kindness that you have already shown to Naomi. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And there's the reference to the word wings. So, Boaz pronounces this blessing upon Ruth. Perhaps Ruth, in the way she phrases this, is saying to Boaz, I think you're the answer to your own prayer. You prayed for me to be blessed, and you're going to be the agent that God uses to bless me. So I'm putting myself under the wings of the God of Israel, and the God of Israel is going to bless me through you. So spread the wing of your garment over me. And that play on words kind of gives us a hint of what Ruth might be up to. Now the question is, what in the world does it mean to spread the wing of your garment over me? Now, as a modern reader, we're reading this and saying, okay, not only is Boaz cold, so is Ruth. So she uncovers his feet, and now she wants him to share the blanket with her. So take your blanket, your coverings, and cover me up too, because I'm freezing out here like you are. That's what it seems to literally mean. But in ancient Hebrew, to spread one's wings over someone was actually a figure of speech for marriage. It was a marriage proposal. And we find that same phrase in a really strange place, Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8. Now, Ezekiel's an interesting prophet. When we all get to the new heaven and the new earth, we should all have lunch with Ezekiel, open our Bibles to the book and say, hey, buddy, explain what in the world you're talking about, because most of the times he's really difficult to understand. And he uses this metaphor. And God is talking to Israel in Ezekiel chapter 16. And God is talking about the fact that he chose Israel when they were nothing. They didn't have a nation. It started with Abraham. It started with one man. And as the nation of Israel grew, God continued to choose them until God ultimately chose them when Moses goes on top of the mountain and brings down the law. And the law was a covenant between God and Israel. And God and Israel both said yes to the covenant. And we read about that in the book of Deuteronomy. So Ezekiel uses the image of marriage. So in this metaphor, when God and Israel said yes to the covenant, God and Israel got married. And God became the groom. And God had unlimited wealth. God could bless Israel. God could take care of Israel. Any need that Israel had, God was the wonderful groom who could take care of that. And Israel had nothing to offer. Remember where Israel was when Moses came along? They were slaves in the land of Egypt. And so God had to rescue them out of Egypt and bring them to Mount Sinai to sign this covenant. So with that in mind, I'm going to read that verse. Later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, or old enough to get married. So God had been bringing Israel along. And now, when he brings them out of Egypt, they're old enough, mature enough, apparently, to get married. So that's the imagery. I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. In other words, I got married to you. And when did it happen? I gave you my solemn oath and entered a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. So, when Moses comes down with the covenant, God and Israel got married. And Ezekiel's going to go on to say, Israel, you've been an unfaithful wife. That phrase, to spread the corner of your garment over you, is a metaphor for marriage. And literally, it symbolizes the gesture of a groom covering his bride with his garment, and it symbolizes the consummation of the marriage, the husband's authority, protection, and provision for his wife. The same things that God did for Israel to provide for them. So, strangely enough, Ruth says, spread the corner of your garment over me. In other words, marry me. Yeah, she proposed. Back in the ancient world, most marriages were arranged. And it was absolutely unthinkable back in the ancient world for a woman to actually propose to a man. But lo and behold, she did it. And then she gives the reason she did it. Since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Some translations, it's a kinsman redeemer. And since Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, he is the one who can provide for her. And it's interesting that Naomi knew this all along. Naomi knew that Boaz was a family member through Elimelech, and she told Ruth that. She also said to Ruth that he is a kinsman redeemer, not the kinsman redeemer. In fact, even Ruth says to Boaz, you are a guardian redeemer, not the one and only guardian redeemer. And we're going to find out there is another one. And apparently Ruth knows that and Boaz knows that as well. Now, normally a kinsman redeemer would redeem property. He would redeem the family name. It's not usual for him to get married to someone. However, this understanding of guardian redeemer means that you do whatever is necessary for the family to protect them. And Ruth needs protection and security that can only be provided by a husband in the ancient world. So as the guardian redeemer, the right thing for him to do would be to not only preserve the family line of Elimelech, preserve the property, but also marry Ruth. So, here's what happens. Boaz says to Ruth, who are you? And she says, I'm your servant, Ruth. And then Ruth turns around and tells Boaz who he is. You're a guardian redeemer. So in other words, since you're a guardian redeemer, do your duty. Play the part. I mean, talk about putting it on the line. I mean, here's a servant young lady demanding that her boss marry her. I mean, this is a Moabite demanding that an Israelite do what she says. This is a woman making a demand of a man. This is a poor person making a demand of a rich person. I mean, this is crazy. And the one thing we really don't know, was this Naomi's idea all along? Or did Ruth make this up when Boaz asked, who are you? Well, then the question is, how will Boaz respond? Because let's face it, Boaz, he holds all the cards. I mean, she can propose, but it's up to him. I mean, will he get angry? It's like, who are you, a Moabite woman, to tell me, a wealthy Israelite landowner, what to do? Will he reject her? He says, Ruth, I'm willing to give you all the grain you need, but I'm just not attracted to you. You're not my type. He could say that. Or will he agree? So all the cards are in his hands. Verse 10. And if you think Ruth's response was a little strange, well, here's Boaz's response. The Lord bless you, my daughter. Which is interesting. The Lord bless you. So he pronounces a blessing upon Ruth. And there's one thing for sure at this point. He does not perceive her as a prostitute. Because, you just don't pronounce a blessing upon a prostitute using God's name. So he doesn't see her that way. And what's interesting is the blessing is identical to the blessing that Naomi pronounced upon Boaz back in chapter 2, verse 20. And I'll show you that verse in a moment. It also breaks the tension in the story. Okay. Nothing bad's going to happen. Maybe something good will happen, but nothing horrible is going to happen to Ruth. The tension has been broken. And then Boaz proceeds to say, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. And the word kindness, interestingly enough, it's the Hebrew word hesed. It's the covenant love between God and Israel. It's the same word. Hesed can mean kindness, faithfulness, loyalty, love, compassion, mercy, grace, all wrapped up into one. It's kind of like the word agape. It's really difficult to come up with just one word for it. So this is the covenant love. And so Boaz responds to Ruth by saying, this kindness that you're showing to me is greater than the kindness you showed earlier. Well, what was the earlier kindness? Well, that was showed to Naomi. Because Ruth left her country, she left her family, she left her friends, she left her Moabite religion, and she comes to the land of Israel where she's a foreigner, never been there before, and she adopts the religion, the culture of Naomi, which happens to be of the Jewish people. And she gave up everything to take care of Naomi. And she was true to her word. Because when they get to the land of Israel, to Bethlehem, and she looks around and goes, we have no food, it was Ruth who went out and gleaned. You know, she didn't say to Naomi, hey, go get us some food. No, she goes out to get the food. So now, by choosing Boaz, there is a sense in which Ruth is showing even greater kindness to Naomi. Boaz is a kinsman redeemer. By marrying him, if it works out, then Ruth, of course, will be taken care of. But so will Naomi, because he can redeem the property that's owned by Elimelech. He can also redeem the family line of Elimelech. It won't die out if Boaz and Ruth get married. So Boaz looks at this marriage proposal, which, by the way, he didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. Instead, he blessed her and then talked about her kindness being greater than what was shown earlier. Now, here's Ruth chapter 2, verse 20. And this verse, in many ways, starts to be fulfilled in chapter 3, verse 10. The Lord bless him, meaning Boaz. The Lord bless Boaz, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness, his hesed, to the living and the dead. Boaz is a man of kindness. Ruth is a woman of kindness. And it plays back and forth in a blessing from God. That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. So, Boaz goes on to say in the last part of the verse, you have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. Now, we don't know the age of Boaz because the text doesn't say. But based upon his position in society, the way he responds to Ruth by calling her my daughter, chances are Boaz may be as old as Naomi from that generation. So Boaz is significantly older than Ruth. And he says to her, you know, you could have gone after the younger men. In fact, it's the choice young men. Meaning, if you marry a younger man, your odds are better that you can have children. And your odds are better that he's going to live long enough to take care of you. But by choosing Boaz, will they be able to have children? That's a question mark. He's older. Don't know how old he is. And if she chooses Boaz, and he's older, Ruth could end up a widow again. So there were some chances in doing this. Now, were the young Israelite men really interested in a Moabite woman? Don't know. One thing that the text also doesn't say is what did Ruth look like? We're never told if she's a beautiful young woman. We're not told anything about her physical appearance. So we really don't know. So, Boaz says, Ruth, could have gone after a young guy. Instead, you've chosen me, an older man, so that you could show kindness to Naomi, so that I could not only marry you, but also redeem her property in the family name. But I wonder if Boaz is selling himself a little short. Maybe Boaz is being too humble. It reminds me of what happened several years ago at one of the women's events that we had over in Victory Hall. And one of the ladies from the church brought a friend. And I got introduced to the friend. And I don't know if the friend was kidding or if she was really being serious, but she asked me to help find her a husband. And I kind of laughed. Said, that's really not in my job description, but, I can pray for you. And then she goes on to say, now, when you find me a husband, make sure you find me a Boaz and not a bozo. Well, Boaz proves not to be a clown. He's a wealthy man. He's a landowner. He has a great position in the community. He's well respected by everyone in Bethlehem. He's God-fearing. From the first time we meet him, he talks to his workers, asking God to bless them. So he's certainly somebody who's following God. He's generous. He's honorable. But we really don't know about his marital status. Because, again, the text doesn't say. Is he married? Will Ruth become wife number 2, 3, or 4? We know that David is born later, and David had several wives. So as a rich landowner, maybe he has 2, 3, or 4 wives. That's possible. What about his children? We're not told about his children either. Or could Boaz be single? Did he never get married? Or did he get married and his wife passed? We don't know. We're not told anything about that. Well, it's a story about Hesed. It's a story about kindness. Because this is where kindness wins both ways. If Boaz marries Ruth, he shows kindness to her. She's a Moabite woman. And now she's going to be the wife of a rich landowner. That's quite a step up. She went from the bottom right to the top. And Boaz gets a wife. And if he doesn't have one, he gets a young wife. And Naomi, the property is redeemed. The family name is redeemed. And it's all because people live with Hesed, loving kindness to one another. So this could be a story where love and kindness win. And don't they still win today? Sometimes we don't look at life that way. Sometimes we're taught to look out for number one. But here are 3 people who don't look out for themselves, they look out for each other, and they all win in the end. Something to think about. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this remarkable story. And Father, what a story it is to teach us that doing the right thing, showing loving kindness, not looking out for ourselves but for everyone else, actually produces a win-win-win for everybody. That everyone wins when everyone does the right thing. So, Father, may that be something we take home with us. May that be something we apply to all our relationships, to every dealing that we have with people. May we always seek out the win-win for everyone. Thank you, God, also for your hand in this story. You're not necessarily mentioned in every place, but we know you had a plan. And we'll find that out at the end of the book as well. So, Father, thank you that even in the middle of our story, you have a plan for us. And we may not know the ending yet, but we know that you're guiding the story. And we need to have faith in what you're doing. So increase our faith, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.